And thank you very much for coming to what is now the 4th annual Osher lecture. Each year we try to use some of the proceeds from our Osher endowment to bring a speaker on an interesting topic to Hanover. And it's a delight this year to have John Leland join us from New York City. John did his bachelor's in English at Columbia. He then went on to be a senior editor at Newsweek and editor-in-chief of Details magazine. He has been with the New York Times since 2000, and several years ago began at his own idea of following 6 people who were age 85 and over. And the stories that came out of this year-long adventure became the basis for his book, Happiness is a Choice You Make, Lessons from a Year Among the Oldest Old. John is going to talk about what he learned, but afterwards he will also have books that are available behind, outside, and will be signing them for those of you who would like them. It is a great pleasure to welcome John Leland.
Thank you, Brad. You guys aren't here for randomized algorithms? That's a shame. Can you hear me okay? Good. Well, thank you all for coming out, and thank you for having me here in this beautiful campus. I could have not gotten here by natural means, I can say, but I'm quite delighted to be here. And, welcome to the Happiness Tour. It's spring is finally here. It's a beautiful day. The students are all out on campus. So I'm going to talk today about getting old and dying. And I'll be honest and real, and if I do it right, it'll be upbeat and uplifting, because getting old, living long and not forever are 2 of the gifts we're given. And I'm going to ask you to think about old age not as a problem that needs to be fixed, but as a resource that we have to tap. You know, this is a period of scarcity. We're running out of clean water, and we're running out of affordable housing. But old age is more abundant now than it's ever been in the history of the world. And some people look at this abundance and call it an age tsunami or a silver tsunami, something coming to crash on our shores. And other people look at it and call it grandma or dad or the face in the mirror. And I want to talk about what we can learn, however old we are, for people who have lived long enough to know something about life. And you can't get it on the internet. You can't read it in the New York Times. You can't Google this information, and Facebook can't sell it to the Russians. But the beautiful thing is that all we have to do is listen and take a deep breath and listen some more and maybe say thank you. And I want to say a little bit about those 2 words, thank you, because I never really understood what, I'd always tried to say please and thank you as a matter of being polite, and I understood that gratitude was thought of as a virtue, but I never really understood what gratitude was or what a powerful thing it could be until I met a man named Fred Jones. And this was in early 2015, and Fred was living alone in a walk-up apartment, and he was in the process of losing 2 toes to gangrene. And his closest daughter was dying of breast cancer. See, I told you this would be upbeat. And whenever I would ask Fred what was his favorite time of the day, Fred would never hesitate. He would say, get a big smile on his face and say, waking up in the morning and saying, thank God for another day, on my way to 110. And you see that smile, and I didn't get it. I didn't understand what Fred could have to be grateful for, or how he could possibly be looking forward to, another 20, 25 years of that. But I knew that every time I went to see him, I came away happier than I was going in. And part of that was just Fred. Fred was a player. He had 6 kids by 4 different women. And he was always telling a dirty story, or pretending he could speak German, or telling me about the flashy suits he used to wear before his orthopedic shoes cramped his style. One of the first times we got together, we went to a supermarket, and Fred cruised the cashiers to see which was the prettiest before checking out. He liked to say he was a bon vivant, and he never pronounced it the same way twice. And he was always asking me to fix him up with one of those real fine chicks that I knew, because I, too, was a bon vivant. And as you can see, Fred had a great smile, although he sometimes left his teeth in restaurants. So after a couple months of visiting him and always getting that same contact high, I figured I should follow Fred's lead. And I don't mean that I cruise the cashiers in supermarkets, but instead of grumbling over things that were wrong in my life, which I'm very, very good at, by the way. Being a journalist, you learn to be a good complainer. But instead of doing that, I started to give thanks for the things that were good in my life. And I started with the easy things, like the love I'd had from my parents growing up, or that I get to go to a job that I actually like doing, and that I have this amazing alarm system that never fails to wake me up, even on the weekends. So, this was the easiest stuff. But it sent me on a second train of thought that took me where I wasn't expecting. And what I mean is, I began to understand gratitude the way that Fred did. And for Fred, it wasn't just that, that feeling of momentary warmth you get when someone gives you something or does you a good favor. It wasn't a situational response to something. For Fred, it was a way of looking at the world all the time. This gratitude is acknowledgement that there's forces outside of yourself that are responsible for many of the good things in your life, and that most of them come your way without you having to do anything to make them possible. Like you didn't have to invent chocolate or sex, even though there might be that little thing you do, I know. But you didn't have to write the great works of Mozart, and you don't have to push anybody out of the way to enjoy these things. And being grateful this way means that seeing the world isn't an opponent you need to beat out or a punishment you need to push back against. More often than not, the world's on your side. And this, I have to say, was an entirely different way of looking at the world than the one I'd had before. All these benign forces all around, all the time. On good days, same as bad days. Like you can be thankful for sex, even when you haven't had it in a while. You can be thankful for the music of Duke Ellington, even when your neighbor is cranking the Kenny G. And the good news about gratitude in this way is that we know how to move the needle, right? It doesn't take years of therapy, and it doesn't take medication. The researchers who study this have found that the very simple thing of just writing down one thing that you're grateful for every day helps people sleep better. They become more optimistic about life. They have lower blood pressure, less inflammation, better immune function, and lower levels of the stress hormone, cortisol. So, it seems like such a simple thing, and I have to admit that I never actually did it, wrote down the things. But I started to give thanks every day for things in my life, because I figured if Fred did it, I had no excuse not to. So, and it's easy, right? Think of what it'd be like if before you got going in the morning, you just said, thanks for indoor plumbing, or like antibiotics, or this beautiful campus that you see all the time. It might make some of your complaints look kind of small, and maybe you wouldn't have time for them at all. And I think that's what happened with Fred. And when I understood this and started doing this, it was like flipping a switch. It didn't make the mess on the nightly news any prettier, and it didn't make my grievances go away. But it put them in perspective, and it shrunk them down to size. And then I understood why Fred was always in a good mood. And it wasn't because his life was so easy, because it wasn't. it was because he always found something to be grateful for, even when it was very, very hard. And once I took this to heart, I never wanted to go back to the way I was before. And what I mean by that is my friend Julie says, I'm the last person you would ever expect to write a book about happiness. And it's true, she's not the only friend that'll tell you that. But at least it was true. You know, by nature, I'm kind of a Grump asaurus. You know, most years, my top 10 movie list has maybe like 4 movies on it, because everything else kind of pisses me off. And this anger and dissatisfaction were fuel that got me going in the morning. You know, and they were productive. I won't hide that. But they were also corrosive for me and my relationships with the people in my life. And this book is a story of how I gave that up and the things I learned from people who were experts at living life. And it's not really a book about old age. It's a book about what we can all learn and how we can all live better now. It just happens to be informed by 6 pretty wise elders. The story begins, as John mentioned before, in 2015, when I set out to write a year-long newspaper series about people age 85 and over, who are known as the oldest old. My starting point was a census report that said that this was one of the fastest growing age groups in the country. So when I was born, there were fewer than 1 million people 85 and up, and now there's close to 6 million. So, you know, imagine there suddenly being 6 times as many teenagers running around. Don't get scared. We'll do randomized algorithms if you get too scared. So, you know, I want to know if there's so many more older people now, what were their lives like from the moment they got up in the morning to the time they went to bed at night? And what role did we have for them in the society now? And I wanted to know this from the true experts, meaning the people who were living it. You know, so much of what we think we know about old age comes from people who have never been old. It's as if like everything you ever heard about Italy came from somebody who had never been to Italy. As one of the women in my book is always telling her daughter, I was your age, but you were never my age. And you can't argue with that, right? Even if your mother says it, you can't argue. So I began this series by looking for characters, which is how I begin most of my work. And, you know, I found 6 great ones. They were gay and straight and black and white and Asian. There was a retired civil servant and an artist who was still working at 95. There was a man who never settled down and a woman who never dated after losing her husband at 50 years. And there was a couple who met in a nursing home, and they really impressed me. They had the courage to fall in love and love each other, even knowing that they probably couldn't do so for very long, and that one of them would watch the other one die. Now, as a writer, whatever you're writing, you hope to introduce your readers to some interesting characters so that they get to know somebody, and then let the characters do the work. And these characters, I think, came through for me. And over the next year, they became like my surrogate elders. So like real elders, they gave me clippings to read, pushed the chocolates on me when I visited, and said, John, why don't you visit more often? And my idea was that I'd follow them for a year and record the toll that their age was taking on their minds and their bodies. Maybe they'd fall, maybe their health would fail, maybe their memory would start to go. Because I figured what else was there to say about old age? And at first I found exactly what I was looking for. You know, Fred, there he was up there. You know, Fred was practically housebound in an apartment he couldn't afford to move out of, up the stairs that he couldn't walk without excruciating pain. Ping Wang, who's next to him, Ping lived on just $700 a month, and she couldn't afford her lidocaine patches for her sore joints. So she would tear them in half to make them last longer. John Sorensen, oh, there's John, where is he? John Sorensen lost his partner of 60 years, and every time we got together, he said he wanted to die. John said one time, he said, the only bad thing about dying is that I won't be around long enough to enjoy the fact that I finally died. We all have our hardships. So, for a newspaper reporter, this is great material, because journalism loves a good problem. But as I spent time with them, what I realized was that just looking at their problems wasn't getting at how they saw their lives. Whatever their hardships, none of them defined themselves by these. Only other people did that. They'd all lost something. They'd lost their spouses or their mobility or their keen eyesight or hearing. But none of them had lost everything. And they all lived for the things that they could still do, not for the things they'd lost. And so this became my first overarching lesson of my time with them, that whatever hardships we have, whatever age we are, we still have an active say in what role we give them in our lives. It's a choice. As Ping Wong put it, when you're old, you have to make yourself happy. Otherwise, you get older. And I don't mean that we have control over things, that we can just ward off bad events from happening. Bad things happen to all of us. But we do have a choice. We can define our lives by what we lose or by what's still available to us. You can go to a museum and think, I'm in a wheelchair with a group of half-deaf older people, and I don't see as crisply as I used to. Or you can think, Picasso, Rembrandt, which is to say, happiness is a choice you make. True for the old, true for the young. If you can't be happy until all your problems are fixed, you're not going to be happy. Now, the people I spent time with, as you would imagine, understood this a lot better than me. They didn't expect their problems to be fixed. Some of them were only going to get worse. But they went on with their lives. And if they liked reading or art, or they loved listening to music or taking care of their gardens, they put their energies into these things that gave them pleasure. If they liked time with friends or relatives, this might be a little more difficult depending on their mobility, but at least they weren't like trying to squeeze this into their busy work schedules. And the technical term for this is selective optimization with compensation. They select things that they can still do and optimize them and to compensate for the things they can't do. But I prefer the James Brown term for this, which is she got to use what she got to get what she wants. That is, of course, published in the Journal of the American Hot Pants Association, which is not peer-reviewed because James Brown had no peers. But the main thing, getting back to our subject, randomized algorithms, the main thing is that they all looked for things, for their contentment within themselves, not from their outside circumstances, which they knew were going to get bumpy sooner or later. Now, there's an image out there of older people as gloomy and depressed. And some of them are, just as people are unhappy at any age. But it's a false stereotype, and sociologists have known this, and they've measured it for years. And they call it the paradox of aging, that as much as we idealize youth and the hard bodies and the fast minds that come with youth, older people are more content than younger people. They're less afraid of death, less stressed, better able to sustain mixed feelings. And by that I mean being able to find good in circumstances, even when there's some pain or loss. Whereas young people, they tend to focus on that pain or loss. Older people understand that things that seem like the end of the world, usually turn out not to be. So, if I ask people to think about their own lives, who here would really want to be 20 years younger? There's a couple, right? There's always some, but just think about it. Would you want to give up the perspective that you've gained in the last 20 years, or your insight, into yourself and other people, I know that I'm a lot happier than I was 20 years ago. And it's not because I have fewer things to be unhappy about. Maybe I have more. But I'm able to manage them better. And I suspect probably all of us in this room do. We're a little wiser, I hope, less impulsive. We're not as confused about sex and love. Again, I hope. So maybe some of you are still a little confused. But we're smarter about what we want and what we expect, and better able to handle things when we don't get it. Isn't everybody here more the sort of person you'd like to meet than you were 20 years ago? So why are we so uncomfortable thinking about the self that we're going to be 20 years from now? There's various explanations for the paradox of aging, but the one I like comes from a woman named Laura Carstensen, who runs the Longevity Center at Stanford. And her take is that older people and younger people look at the time horizon in front of them differently, and they live their lives accordingly. Young people see a long time horizon in front of them, so they're busy gathering as much information and experience as possible, because they don't know what they're going to need later on. And this is a lot of work, and the not knowing creates a lot of anxiety. So they take organic chemistry because they might want to be a doctor, or they go to corporate networking mixers because they might want to meet somebody who can help them get ahead. And they kiss frogs hoping that they're going to turn out to be princes. But if you've ever taken organic chemistry or gone to a networking mixer, these can be pretty miserable experiences. And since we're on campus, if you've ever kissed a frog, I hope there was affirmative consent. So older people are different, right? Older people see a shorter time horizon in front of them, and they concentrate on things that are more pleasing to them now. Maybe they start the meal with dessert. We did a story on this in the Times about older people starting the meal with dessert. In memory tests, if you show people pairs of images, older people remember the positive ones better than the negative ones, because these are more pleasing memories to hang on to. Younger people remember them both about the same, because they don't know what's going to be on the test. If you look at their brains under scanners, fMRI scanners, functional magnetic resonance imaging scanners, the emotional processing center in the brain, the amygdala, in older people it fires strongly in reaction to positive images and not to negative ones. And this suggests that older people not only retain positive information more, but they're more drawn to it in the first place, which means that what they're looking at, the world that they're looking at, is a little more benign than when they were younger. And, as much as we all rightly fear severe memory loss, a little selective forgetting can be a good thing. If you're young, you have to remember all those painful things you did in your marriage or the people who screwed you at work, because you don't want to repeat the experience. But if you're 80 or 90, you can just let that go, because it's not going to do you any good. Fred described life in the shorter time horizon this way. He said, happiness to me is what's happening now. It's not the next world. It's not the dance you're going to go to tonight. If you're not happy at the present time, you're not happy. Some people say, I get myself a new fur coat for the winter, or I get a new automobile, I'll be happy then. But you don't know what's going to happen by that time. Right now, are you happy? So that's what Fred said. And I think the 6 people I spent time with all found their happiness or contentment in this shorter time horizon. Not that they were always happy, but they didn't feel cheated or broken when things didn't go their way. And at this point, I should introduce you to everybody. Fred, you've met. You could say you know Fred intimately. Helen Moses. Helen was 90 when I met her, and she found the second love of her life in a nursing home in the Bronx with a man named Howie Zeimer. And their on-again, off-again plans to get married have been the best running soap opera in America for the last 3.5 years. Helen is loud and brassy and beautiful, and she's always in a fight with someone or other. And she and Howie had been together for 6 years by the time I met her, but she said they'd never been in an argument. And she said, "You want to know why? Because whatever I say goes. Right, Howie?" "Yes, it does. You wait till I get you home." So Howie, you see Howie up there, he's 21 years younger than she, but he was in a terrible car accident after college, and he suffered a brain injury that made him a lot slower than Helen. And he didn't socialize very well, and he didn't have many friends. And their conversations often felt like old vaudeville routines. And Howie would say, "You're the one woman in my lifetime. I mean it." And Helen would say, "I can't hear you, but it better be good." And before her time in the nursing home, Helen had been married for 60 years. She met her husband the first day of kindergarten because they both cried to be away from their mothers. And when I asked her how love was different at 90, she said, "It's more romantic with Howie. You'll never understand." And she said their first kiss together was delicious. And since they weren't married, Helen did not believe in sex outside of marriage. But she wanted me to know one thing. She said, "I'm not too old for anything. You're never too old for sex." And I have to say that, the time I spent with them, sometimes I didn't really get what Helen was getting out of the relationship, because it was obvious that Howie adored her, but he took up a lot of energy, and he spoke so slowly that Helen would sometimes stop listening in the middle, especially if she didn't have her hearing aids in. But as I spent time with them, I realized that the main thing for Helen was that Howie needed her. And his disabilities just meant that he needed her more. And what she said was, "I take care of him. He's an only child, and he had nobody. And then when his mother and father died, he really had nobody except for me. I try to be everything to him. I think I am." And think of that at 91, to want to be everything to somebody and to feel that you are. I think that's a definition of a satisfying life. John Sorensen. John was a decorator who gave up his career ambitions for a bookseller named Walter Caron. And by the time I met John, he was losing his eyesight and the use of his hands. And John had always thought that when he got old, he would read and play piano. And now he couldn't do either. Ping, I mentioned her income just to $700 a month. But Ping found the sweet spot in the social safety net. She had an apartment in Manhattan in a subsidized building for $200-something a month. She had a home attendant that came for 7 hours every day and did all the cooking and all the cleaning and all the shopping. Not bad, right? She played mahjong every day with the same 3 Chinese women in her building. And she couldn't believe how much more comfortable old age was than when she was younger and working a stressful job in Chinatown, and she'd jam onto a crowded bus to get there and then jam on at the end of the day to go back home, and then have to take care of her family when she got home. Ruth Willig. Ruth had to move out of her assisted living facility when the owner decided to sell the place for luxury condos. So at 90, she had to start all over again in a brand new building in a strange neighborhood, far from her daughter, without the friends she'd made in the old building. And Ruth had grown up the youngest of 4 siblings, and she was the rebel in the family. But now she was the oldest. And she'd taken on a new role in the family as the family matriarch, the one who held all the branches together. So this is important, I think, that what she was doing is finding new ways to be helpful for her children, even as she was accepting a little bit more and more help from them. And Ruth, when I asked her about the research showing that older people were more content than younger people, she just shook her head and said, "Not me, not I." And Jonas Mekas, the 6th, Jonas is a pioneer in avant-garde cinema. It could be that some of you have heard his name before. Jonas is 95. He turned 95 on Christmas Eve. And he's still making movies and publishing books. And I called him the other day, and he was on his way to London to do a book signing. Jonas wore me out. But he didn't get there by an easy route, as he'd been a sickly kid, and people didn't expect him to survive childhood. And after that, he survived the brutal tyrannies of the past century. He was a teenager in Lithuania when Stalin's Soviet tanks came in and occupied the country. And then in Germany, he was put in Nazi forced labor camps. Not death camps, because he wasn't Jewish, but forced labor camps. And still, in the title of his most recent movie, he refers to himself as a happy man. So I asked him why he was happy. And Jonas said, it's normal. It's not normal not to sing, not to dance, not to cultivate poetry and the saints, not to be interested in matters of spirit. I am a very, very normal case, and I'm happy. Happiness is a normal state. So happiness is a normal state. So those are the 6. And the 7th teacher was my mother. Come on, Mom. Who says, if you want to know what old age is like, it stinks. My mother said the other day that she'd been to so many doctors lately that on her tombstone she wants it to read, "You look good." I think some of you are relating to that one. So each of them had different lessons to teach, and I won't go into them in great detail here because they each get a chapter in the book. But Fred was a graduate seminar in gratitude. Ping, that you had to choose happiness. You couldn't wait for circumstances to bring it to you, because circumstances go up and down. And I think Ping was better at adjusting to circumstances than almost anyone I'd ever met. Including in the last year, she's been adjusting to dementia that's, as it's increased, has meant that she's had to move out of her apartment, and now she's in a nursing home in New Jersey near her daughter. And the transition was really hard for her, giving up that mahjong group and this apartment that she took so much pride in. But the way she adjusted to it was the way she'd adjusted to everything in her life, with the body she had at the time and with the resources she had at the time, and making do and adjusting as well as she could. And it didn't make it easy, but she'd spent 90 years dealing with loss, and she knew how to deal with loss. And she said, you train your brain to deal with difficult challenges. I learned something from loss. If you've never met something bad, you don't know how to deal with it when you do. So John Sorensen, who said every time we met that he wanted to die, he taught me how to live with death, and how acknowledging death and really living with it as a presence in your life, not as something that happens to other people, was a step toward a fuller and more fulfilling life now. It meant that every time he watched one of his favorite movies or listened to music he loved or had a visit from a friend, he treated it as if it might be the last time. So he absorbed every minute of it. He was just focused in on it. He wasn't, looking at his cell phone or checking his likes on Facebook. And John, I have to say, was something of a complicated case, because he loved to talk, and talking always got him in a good mood, even talking about wanting to die. So, I would say, John, do you really wish you were dead? And John would say, well, no, because we're having this conversation. And I would say, okay, well, I'm going to leave soon. Do you want to die, after I leave? And he would say, no, because Anne is coming tomorrow. Anne was his partner Walter's niece. And then Scott was coming, and Alex, and then Marcus, who were his home attendants and friendly visitors. So these were the pleasures that he had in his life, and he didn't want to give them up, not any of them. So it wasn't that he objected to his existence as it was. Wanting to die meant he enjoyed his pleasures more than most. His Wagner was better than my Wagner, because he listened more intently. And we talk about living each day as if it's our last. John actually did that, and I got to see what that looked like. Helen taught how to love and be loved and be needed, even when she couldn't do all the things she used to do. And Ruth, she nourished, and she was nourished by the people that mattered to her, and she kind of shut out the people who didn't, which would be a good thing for all of us. And Jonas lived every day with a sense of purpose, to make his art. And I think just as important, he didn't get eaten up by things that hadn't actually happened. And Jonas said, I never worry. I'll start to worry when something happens. Why worry about it when it's not happening? And then why worry about it when it happens? You deal with it. You waste time worrying, and it may never happen what you think. Nothing is hopeless. I don't even know what it means, hopeless. And I have to say, in the last year or so, there hasn't been a week go by that I don't quote that either to myself or to other people. But so these were their lessons, and you can wait till you're 85 or 90 to learn them, or you can put them to use now. Now, I'm sorry to say that Fred Jones died in April of 2016. I never did get to fix him up with one of those real fine chicks I know, or take him to the Red Lobster, which we talked about. John Sorensen died 2 months later. And John was in a lot of pain at the end, and he stopped eating because I think now he really was ready to go. But he also spent those last days listening to the music he loved more than anything. And he gave such great thanks to anyone who came to see him. And I was with him on one of his last days, and the physical therapist came by, and he saw John, and then he said he'd be back again the next day. And John was so weak, and he stares up at him from the bed and says, I look forward to it already. And how many of us live like that? How many people live like that? But we all can. My friend Robert Moss, who's 84, he'll turn 84 next week. And he's still directing plays up and down the East Coast. Robert told me once about a visit to his cardiologist. And the cardiologist says, Mr. Moss, I got some bad news. Exactly what you want to hear from your cardiologist, right? So he says, you're going to live to 100. So Robert was confused by this. He goes, is that bad news? And the cardiologist says, is that good news? Everybody's a comic. So Robert started a successful theater company that's still going in what was then a pretty scruffy part of Hell's Kitchen in New York. And years later, when he was asked how he was able to accomplish all the things that he has, Robert said, I never thought about what would happen if it rained. And in the last couple of years, since he told me that, I've been going back to those words again and again, because they don't mean that Robert encountered fewer hardships than other people, but he didn't get paralyzed by things that might or might not happen. And he learned by necessity how much he could accomplish even when it rained. So the elders that I wrote about, they were all proof that you can lead a fulfilling and full life, even when the weather turns stormy. And yet we all see people who give up their plans because there's some clouds in the forecast. I think what the lesson I learned from them is, live your life, put on a show, take a chance. You get wet sometimes. If we're living longer, don't we have like an obligation to live better, to be a little wiser and braver, more forgiving and grateful, less vengeful and covetous? At least we can try. I think that all those things make life better for everyone around, but especially the person trying to live them, even when we don't get there. At the beginning of this talk, I mentioned that old age tends to be defined by people who have never been old. So the metaphor is a machine that's breaking down. It doesn't produce or perform like it used to, which is exactly the kind of metaphor you'd expect from people in a stage of life where you're judged by how well you perform or how much you produce. But who says we're machines or that we're just machines? Maybe we're like a savings account. or a violin, and we're accruing interest or gaining a richness in tone as we get older. I like to think I'm a couch cushion. You know, maybe I'm getting a little out of shape and I have some crumbs stuck in the seams. But like I'm also the repository for all those coins and all those keys, all the richness of the years that came before. So in the last year, the ugliness of the nightly news has put to test whether these lessons really held up under pressure. You know, with the barrage of things going on, am I still happy? And the answer is yes. And I've needed these lessons more and more. I've just relied on them and relied on the wisdom of the people, especially as things got ugly. And I learned some things. After the election, I took stock of the things that made my life worthwhile. And I found that they'd all persevere. Spending all that time with people over age 85 who were literally dealing with matters of life and death helped me see what was important and what was just noise. So politics matter, of course. Money matters, health matters. But they aren't really the makings of a life well lived. And at some point in your travels, one or more of these are going to fail you. But the things that are more substantial in your life, like companionship and purpose and contentment, beauty and love, like these do not depend on what happens in Washington or on Wall Street. Good friends and good food, art and warmth and worth, these are things that we have in abundance already. We just need to choose them as our lives. So I ask people to try a little thought experiment. Imagine a good life for yourself at 85 or 90. What does it look like? You want some health and some money, of course, but we all know people who are healthy and wealthy and miserable, whatever age, right? So what's a good life? How about friends around you, supportive family, someone to listen to, someone to talk to, a passion for something that you love doing? And if this is the kind of life, kind of old age you want, how do you get there? Working more time at the office now? I don't think so. Spending more time with friends and loved ones now. Finding a purpose in life and going for it. Not a bad way to live, right? It beats a lot of things that we put our energy into, and it sure beats being afraid that someday you might get old. A definition of despair that I read recently is not being able to imagine a plausible, desirable future for yourself. Plausible, desirable future. Well, fear of old age does that, right? If you're afraid of getting old, you can't plausibly desire it. But the flip side is also true, that rethinking old age means seeing it as something that you can plausibly desire, and not only that, but you can give thanks for it and move towards it now. Last year, an interviewer asked Jonas Mekas, if you could give any advice to somebody who wanted to be a filmmaker, what would it be? And Jonas's answer was pure Jonas. He said, get a camera. So that's it. If you want to be a filmmaker, get a camera. If you want to be happy, choose happiness. You can wait till you're older, or you can do it now. It's up to you. As for me, in early 2016, before I'd written a word of this book or knew what I wanted it to be, I wrote these 6 words that became the title, Happiness is a Choice You Make, and I taped them up by the side of my bed so that they would be the first thing I saw in the morning and the last thing I saw before I went to bed at night. And just having them there, I didn't really know what I wanted to do with them, what they meant really, but just having them there and seeing them every day was a reminder that it was up to me to choose how I wanted to view my life. And it changed me. It didn't give me washboard abs. It didn't teach me to lean in. You know, it didn't help me recognize or find my love language. But, you know, it helped me give up all these obsessions that people push towards. And I think by that, it helped me think like an old person. And I'm much happier for it. And the book kind of just flowed from there. But as I say in the book's last line, I could be wrong about all this. In which case, I will have spent all those years living more happily in vain. I can live with that. You guys have been very patient with me. Thank you very much. I hope you have some questions about randomized algorithms or anything.
You had 6 people up there and your mom. What was the size of your first sample? How many people did you have to talk to find the 6 that you presented to us?
Can everybody hear the question? She asked how many people I interviewed to find the 6.
Yeah.
I guess maybe 3 or 4 dozen. It's. Oh, okay. Yes, the question was how many people I interviewed to find the 6 up there. And I've said about 3 or 4 dozen. The most fun part of this is the casting. So just going around and meeting a lot of different people, and I went to senior centers, and I went to nursing homes, and I went to book groups, and I looked at people's websites, and I talked to friends of friends, and I just started meeting more and more people. And I wanted people who were very diverse and come from different walks of life, different parts of New York City, different incomes, different levels of mobility. And I wanted one ringer, and that was Jonas Mekas. Because Jonas has left a paper trail, so you knew that he was going to be a very good talker, because I was going to ask people to spend a year with me. And I wanted to make sure there was at least one who had a great perspective on the whole canvas. So it was, my partner used to be an actor, and she says that 90% of directing is casting. So I think I lucked out with this cast. I was searching for something different from what I actually ended up finding. I was searching for this kind of tale of woe, and I found this tale of resilience and joy. So even with all that casting, I still didn't get what I was looking for, and I'm grateful for it. More questions? Yeah. Yes. Wait, she'll bring the microphone around.
So you started with a newspaper article, correct? And then that evolved into the book?
I started with a year-long series in the paper that ran from I started reporting it in the beginning of 2015, and the articles ran from about the middle of 2015 to the end of 2015.
My question is, how hard was it to get your management at the Times to agree this was a worthwhile project?
It's kind of amazing. I'm very fortunate to have good editors, and I've had them over the years. I should have counted that as one of the things I'm grateful for. It was kind of an easy sell. I was surprised. I'd spent a long period of time thinking I wanted to do this as a series of the number in the census was quite compelling. So that was the idea of doing this group of people as a series was a very easy sell. But at first I thought, well, what are the things that go on in this group of people? And I thought, okay, I'll do a story about how people fall, and then your life kind of goes to hell. And I'll do another story about how people are living on a fixed income and their expenses go haywire, and your life goes to hell. And I had a number of those stories, and I thought these are these themes, and the two problems with that is I kind of know how all those stories go, and also, they're not that interesting. So I decided that what I would do is just follow these people and let the stories be wherever they took me. And my editor went for that right away, because I think it had this sense of the unknown to it. Like, we actually don't know where it's going to go. And again, I thought it would go in a southern direction, and it went more northern than I expected.
I'm wondering what's next for you.
Well, I'm about to embark on a series on adolescence. And that, I think, will be a tale of woe. No, I love doing this. As I said, the series ran from the beginning of 2015 to the end of 2015, and then I've stayed in touch with the 4 that are still alive. I write an update at the end of each year, and I do an update when something goes on in their lives. So I will have great anxiety if I ever have to say goodbye to them, but it's time for me to do something different.
Have you decided what age adolescence ends now?
I'm 58, so I think it's probably somewhere around 60, 62. I don't know, does it end? I mean, I love the word adolescent because it says we're in a process, not at a stage, right? You're adolescing, you're becoming an adult, you're becoming something. And I think one of the things that I learned from the older people up here is that we're always becoming. Like, before I started this, I thought of old age as this period of time that's, like, you have this period of time when you're productive and you're living a worthwhile life, and then there's this period of time tacked on at the end when, you know, maybe the grandkids come and visit and they get bored and then they go home. But, you know, it took me a minute to, like, come to think of that this period of time is a time like any other, where we're making decisions about our lives and how we want to live, and we still have needs and wants and desires and passions. So I do like that word, adolescing, and so maybe we're senescing now. Oh, there's someone over there, okay.
I'm really curious about how old people, from your experience, support each other and different ways that happens. You show the picture of family, but to what extent old people can be family for each other? And I ask the question because in my UU church in Woodstock, we have something called the Amazing Grays. It's about 25 older people. They run from 65 to the late 80s. And we get together once a month, and our whole mission is to support each other as we get older. And we do a lot of laughing. And there's something wonderful about old people, but it's even better when they're all together. And we share the same culture, and we support each other. We have the same problems, and we have the same delights and joys. I was wondering if you encounter any of these kind of collective ways of dealing with being older.
Everybody heard the question. I love that question. There's a model of care now called the village model, where people volunteer to do the things they can still do for one another. Maybe if you were still driving, you could drive people to their appointments, or you could do things for each other. I really wanted to get into one of those communities in New York, and it turned out that they were having a very hard time getting a footing in New York, so I wasn't able to do that. But it comes out of Boston, and they've been enormously successful and popular in other parts of the country. Yeah, people, you know, I think that one of the reasons this series in the Times caught on more than any of us expected, and I think it's because people really love seeing these role models. Just, you know, I like to think I did a pretty good job with it, but I think that what really drove people to it were these characters on the page. And you got, you know, people weren't seeing, if you're 85, you're not seeing yourself on TV and movies. You're not seeing news reports about you unless it's about, like, how you're breaking the healthcare system. So just to see somebody who, like, got up in the morning and looked for, like, what made their life meaningful, I think that people really responded to that very strongly, and I give them all the credit for it. But I think that's absolutely correct, that people together are able to show each other the way, because they're the experts in being 92. You see a doctor who's going to tell you about what it's like to be 92. You're like, no, I'm the 92-year-old. I know what it's like. So being around peers is a wonderful thing.
I don't know if I can quite formulate this right, but from older friends I have who are 85 and older, can you reflect how people plan differently? Or do they plan in the same ways they did when they were younger? People have to make plans sometimes.
Are you talking about how people start to make plans after 85, or you're talking about how people make plans for becoming
No,
some...
after 85. How does planning become different?
Well, the plans are much shorter term, right? That's a big part of it. Most of them have gotten to some point in their life. I think that part of the relief of it and part of the reason for that idea of the paradox of aging is you're not trying to plan for everything so much. You accept that it's a shorter time perspective. Things are going to happen. They're going to go in strange and surprising ways. Often the plans are fairly simple. I don't want my life sustained under these circumstances, or this is what I want to happen to my estate. My mother is always concerned with what happens to her body parts. That's the most important thing to her. My mother is a little bit like John Sorensen in that she really is ready to die. She's had enough, and she almost died some years ago, and she's still upset that we authorized treatments that sustained her. But she'd had a heart attack a couple of years ago, and I write about this in the book. My mother really is a character in the book. It's a scary thing doing that. But I'm just going to get that window down, sorry. Okay. Well, there she is again. And she had a heart attack a couple of years ago at the end of 2015, and she was at such great peace because she thought, this is finally going to be the thing that takes me away. And she says, this is the pastor I want to give my sermon, and you should check out his Facebook page. It's all about jazz and his sermons. And then she was so disappointed when it didn't happen. But yeah, I think the plans become very practical. You don't have to think, what mark am I going to make in this world now? How am I going to invent myself? Am I ever going to find love? Am I ever going to find meaning in life?
And some people refuse to plan.
Yeah, as they do, as we're hearing about the baby boomers now, who have decided that they can get into that age without ever saving for retirement. And
so as a recent retiree, I've got a big bucket list, and it really keeps growing. I keep adding things to it. And I'm just wondering, did these people still have a bucket list, or is the key to happiness just throwing the bucket away?
Just pour out that bucket. Jonas Mekas still had things he wanted to do. He still had a bunch of old films that he had never completed, and he felt that now he had stopped doing things for other people and stopped running a film society, and he could concentrate on his own work, and he could do that. I think Helen Moses had her bucket list was really taking care of Howie. Ruth Willig wanted to, be useful to her kids and sort of ease into that role where she was accepting help from them. So I think everybody was a little bit different. Ping Wong, her bucket list was really to find that she had found that sweet spot playing mahjong with the people in her life, and she wanted to replace that. So the bucket list was no longer, making love in the surf in Waikiki. It was something a little bit more closer to home. And I think people were more content because of that, because they didn't have these anxieties about being able to accomplish things in their lives. But bucket list is great. You could call that a purpose in life. And there's a lot of research that shows that having a purpose in life leads to a lot of better health outcomes, including less dementia.
This week there was a report in our local paper, the Manchester Union Leader paper, that the oldest person in the world had died 117 years old. And there was some discussion about supercentenarians And I'm just amused by your term, the oldest old. Maybe it's a matter of perspective, being New York and New Hampshire, but 85 to 92 doesn't impress me as being the oldest old. You know, I've met so many centenarians that, you know, that's one part of my question. And then the other thing is nutritionally speaking, was there any differences in people's perspectives, did you notice? Or could you tell that based on what you were doing? Sorry, that's a two-part question, I know. I don't mean to monopolize your time, but.
Well, I'm not the author of the phrase "the oldest old." That comes from gerontologists who used to think of old age as just being old age and starting at a certain point. And at a certain point, they realized that 75-year-olds and 95-year-olds were different. So they put a break in there and called it 85. But you're right. As we are seeing to more centenarians, which is people over 100, and supercentenarians, which is people over 110, there might need to be a third category there. Nutritionally, yeah, I mean, of course, people ended up, most of the people that were part of my series had pretty good nutrition, or they wouldn't have gotten to 85 in the first place. I talked to a gerontologist the other day, or sorry, a geriatrician, somebody who deals clinically with older people. And he said he didn't have a lot of the centenarians and supercentenarians, and it's because they had had good habits, so they didn't go to him. He had a lot of patients that were like 78, 81, 82, who had serious diabetes or serious heart conditions. The people who made it to 95 and 100 didn't have those things. And his take was that they probably weren't going to. That they'd lived well enough that that wasn't going to be what did them in.
I noticed that of all the group, most of them seem to be living on relatively limited resources, or depending on their Social Security or whatever. You want to comment on the comparison of, we put a high priority in this culture on net worth, even until we die, which can't take it with you. So I'm just curious what we have to say about that. Their incomes were pretty different. Jonas Mekas, I never quite got what his income was, but his rent was about $6,000 a month. So he had some resources, and Ruth Willig's husband had worked in publishing. She had been a microbiologist before she retired to take care of her kids. So I don't think they'd ever made a lot of money, but they'd been very frugal. They'd sent their kids to state schools, and they'd managed to save a lot of money, and they'd been part of that amazing run of the Dow when it ran from 2,000 to 24,000. So that she had some resources at the end. John Sorensen, John's partner had made a pretty good living running a bookstore. He died before there was marriage equality in New York, so they'd never been able to get married. Otherwise, John would have lived on the survivor benefits from Walter, and he would have lived on about twice what he lived on in his case. But none of them, and some of them had good careers, middling careers, or extraordinary careers, none of them ever talked about their work accomplishments to me, and I was really surprised by that. I thought, like, at least once it should come up, but it never came up even once. Some of them missed the camaraderie of the workplace, but none of them, told those war stories about the time they got that great promotion or they beat somebody out. I think that some prudence in financial planning is a very good thing, but I noticed that none of them measured themselves by their net worth.
I wanted to ask if you encountered some people who were sort of the opposite of some of the examples you've been showing us. People who had enough money, they were comfortable, they were in fairly good health, their circumstances were really pretty much okay, and yet they were very unhappy and miserable at the thought of being old, and they weren't going to get any younger, and things were gradually getting a bit worse, and they were the opposite of being happy with what they had left. Did you encounter people like that?
Mainly the one that gave birth to me.
But yeah, I did. You know, again, like I mentioned that Ruth Willig said she didn't buy that line that older people were more content than younger people. And she was living in a comfortable place. She'd had some setbacks, but she wasn't like, her life wasn't miserable because of the setbacks. But yeah, people were all over the place. There are people are unhappy at any age. You know, someone told me like a grumpy old man is a grumpy young man who got old. And, you know, there's all of us, whatever age we are, whatever financial means we have, there's things that we feel we should be able to do, and we kind of feel like a little bit screwed that we're not able to do those, or we feel like a little bit cheated. And I think that probably the people in my study had been more like that when they were a little younger. And they'd kind of gotten to this point where they accepted that there were going to be limitations in their lives, and they were going to have to make the most. It was going to be up to them to make the most of them. But there are people that don't feel that way, absolutely. And I might add that I think some of the more comfortable people, economically comfortable people, have greater expectations. They say, God, I did everything right. I saved all this money. I did all this stuff. Shouldn't everything be perfect for me now? And they have a little bit of a harder time adjusting to that.
Thank you for your presentation. Have you given this presentation to a group of, say, 20 to 30-year-olds? And is their reception different? Because I have a very hard time talking to my kids about any of these ideas. Unfortunately, they're like I was at their age. How do we break that barrier?
I would say the invitation for this talk this evening or this afternoon went out to people of all ages. There are some younger people, I'm told, on campus. I don't happen to see many of them. My younger brother was, my son was very eager to read my book about Jack Kerouac, but a little bit less eager to read this one. But yeah, I think that 25-year-olds, 30-year-olds they think they'll never get old. That's true. And they don't have parents that are in the age group that I'm writing about also.
When thinking about this talk, I assumed you would start with the definition of what is happiness, because for me, that was the turning point. I sat down one day and said, well, wait a minute, what is it that would make me happy? And it was a major turning point. I all of a sudden said, I guess I never knew what happiness was, but this is what it is.
Tell us. What did you come up with?
Well, I was lucky in high school that I had a class in decomposing ads. So I learned very early that buying a new car was not a sign of happiness or a solution to unhappiness. And I knew I wasn't ever going to be the richest person in the world, so I decided I would be the most successful poor person, and that has worked very nicely.
You know, I'm kind of inspired by Fred Jones's thing when he says, happiness is what's happening now. And I think it's that being able to find a completeness like within the things that are available to you right now. I think that it's a little vague and airy-fairy maybe, but that gets to be pretty close to happiness, finding satisfaction in the things that you've done, the things that you've made possible, and what's available to you now. Tomorrow might be another day, but being happy today is being happy.
Did you get feedback from the people reading their stories as it went along? And how do they feel reading about each other?
Most of them were not curious about the others. I had an interesting experience. Ruth Willig. Ruth had expressed a lot of complaints about her life and the situation she was in. And when I published those in the first article, she was very upset with that because she thought, that's not me. And I didn't really understand it. And I thought, like, Ruth, all you ever do is complain. You know, like she was really very angry and bitter about being forced to move out of her place so that the owner could sell it for luxury housing. She felt like anybody that displaces a group of 90-year-olds for the sake of profit, you know, was disgusting. So that was Ruth's take. But I came to see that her complaints were not so much grievances, but they were her way of asserting leverage on her life. Like it was her way of not accepting it passively, but acting on it and making it her life. You know, Ruth, when I talked to Ruth, her conversation kind of went one of two ways. She talked about things that happened to her, and these were almost always bad, and things that she did for herself, and these would be good things. And I think that when she made complaints about things, that was her way of doing something for herself, acting on it. So she was the one who complained about her portrayal. The others, I think, really liked having someone visit them every couple weeks. Someone to talk to. Just someone saying, you know what? Your life is important. What you have to say matters. And it matters not just to your kids or the people that know you, but it really makes a difference to the world. And so I think people liked being a part of it. And Ruth's daughter said it actually brought her out of the depression that she'd got from moving, just having people interested in her. And then the other thing is, you know, the New York Times just goes out to the world, so everybody started hearing from people they went to grade school with. And I'll tell you one story about this. Jonas Mekas in the early 1970s, I believe, had been running a theater, and he was showing different movies, art house movies, and he showed one called Flaming Carrots, I think is the name of the movie, by Jack Smith. And it was an early queer cinema movie, and it had some nudity and some sex in it, and he was told that if he showed it, he would be arrested. So this is a great opportunity. So Jonas shows it, gets arrested. The prosecutor read the article and said, oh my God, Jonas Mekas is still alive. I owe that man an apology.
Great story.
And he got, you know, I said, Jonas, do you want to give this DA who prosecuted you your number? He says, oh yeah, bring it. You know, I want to talk to him. And they got together and he apologized. There's one over here. Oh, over here.
I'm 21 years old. In response to the earlier question, if I take lessons from the oldest old now, will I learn all the things I need to on the way there?
Will you learn all the things you need to? No. Your life should be like a continuous process of learning. You know this. You don't need me to tell you this. Go on there. We fund your parents' tuition. No. Give yourself some credit for being here. And you're lucky you're in a room where nobody has made fun of millennials, because everywhere I go, people are very critical of millennials. You won't learn everything, but you'll learn some lessons that can be very valuable to you. And you'll be able to apply them. And it's not too soon to start being happy. But thank you for that. Another millennial?
I have a question that I'm not quite sure how to formulate it. What can you tell us about your people? How much medical and visits to doctors and medical interventions in their lives have they had, or have they had very, very little? Therefore, very fewer drugs in them as they grew along into old age.
They varied. Fred Jones had spent a fairly long period of time doing rehab at a nursing home before I met him, and then a good part of the year that I spent with him doing rehab because he had parts of 2 toes amputated. So he spent the most time in care, but all of them spent a fair bit of time. Ping Wang would go to the doctor fairly regularly. I'm trying to think who else. Jonas said he saw his doctor, and his doctor said he'd live to 120. And Jonas believed it. He said, yeah, that's normal. I'm normal. It's all those others that get obsessed with sex and drugs and all these other things and live in some level of excess. So Jonas just attributed everything to like eating oats in the morning. And so he didn't have a lot of medications in his life, but everybody else was kind of in between. I think probably on average they took 7 or 8 medications at that age, which is just about average. I'm sorry, were you trying to get at something? Okay. Okay.
I'm just interested in the concept of happiness, and you had 3 people who I think you or they would describe maybe they're not happy, like John and Ruth and your mom to some extent. If you asked them, would they say they were happy? But you perceive them as, like when you spent time with them, you ended up feeling better. So it's interesting that they kind of seem like they're always saying, I'm ready to go. Would they have described themselves as being happy?
Well, John, I would talk about this with John, and John would say that in the moment that he was happy, but he dreaded the idea that there would be a long time in front of him and it would be marked by a long and slow decline. And I think that's the thing that Ruth feared as well. So the lives that they had, that they were living day to day, they found contentment and I think happiness in those for the most part. My mother maybe a little bit less so. But the main thing that they dreaded was something in the future that wasn't happening to them. And it was very interesting. The one thing that happened was the goalposts moved over the course of my 3 years with them now. And they would say, you know, if I'm ever have to walk with a cane, that's when you're really old. And then they walk with a cane, and they're like, well, if you ever have to walk with a walker, that's it. Almost everybody feared dementia more than physical decline.
So if they stayed in the moment, that's how they stayed content.
Yes. Yeah. Well, my laptop died, but the one slide I wanted to leave you with was I showed you the piece of paper that I have on my wall. And there's this piece of paper that Jonas has on his wall to see every day. And it says, keep dancing, keep singing, have a good drink, and do not get too serious. Okay?